Hi guys, and welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuaries channel. Tonight, we walk through a quiet museum hall where the lights are low. The air is cool, and a small lump of baked clay sits behind glass, like it is pretending to be harmless. You lean in, and the tiny wedge marks start to shimmer, as if the tablet is still damp and the story is still being pressed into it. Somewhere in those scratches is a flood so big it eats roads, rooftops, and your last shred of confidence. And yes, you probably won't survive this, at least not with your dignity intact, because you are about to fall asleep while ancient gods argue about plumbing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and your local time. I love seeing how far the night reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand close enough that your breath fogs the glass for half a second. Then the museum air conditioner clears it away. The tablet is not large or dramatic. It is more like a burnt cookie someone dropped in dirt 5,000 years ago and then decided to keep. The surface is packed with neat impressions, rows of tiny wedges like bird tracks marching in formation. You tilt your head and the wedges shift from scratches to symbols. A god glances over with a look that says, "Please do not adopt the artifact." And you nod like a responsible adult, which is already your first lie tonight. This is Cuneiform, a writing system born in Mesopotamia when people need to count grain and cannot trust memory. A reed stylus presses into soft clay, making wedges that stack into signs. That clay can hold taxes, spells, court cases, and myths, all without a single drop of ink. Over centuries, the signs serve different languages, like Sumerian and Akkadian, so every line feels like it carries echoes. You picture a scribe smoothing the surface with a wet finger, the ancient version of undo, then pressing again, steady as a heartbeat. You picture its earlier home, the library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where thousands of tablets sit stacked like dense, dusty tweets that never log out. In the 19th century, excavators haul crates of them to London, fragments mixed together, waiting for someone stubborn. In 1872, a self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith reads a passage about a god-sent flood and a man told to build a vessel. The room reportedly erupts, and Smith loses his Victorian calm so completely that the story becomes famous twice, once on clay and once in gossip. You stare at the wedges and feel that same jolt, only quieter, because museum rules are strict. The label beside the glass uses careful words, something like flood tablet, Akkadian, 2nd millennium BCE. And suddenly, time feels stretchy. You know rivers here, the Tigris and the Euphrates, are not gentle house plants. They jump their banks. They change course. They turn farmland into brown ocean. Archaeologists have even found flood deposits at some ancient sites in southern Iraq. Thick layers of silt that hint at real disasters people could not forget. Historians still argue whether the Great Flood in these texts reflects one specific catastrophic event or a whole memory of many floods stitched together. Standing here, you do not need to choose. You just feel how a community turns panic into narrative, how a near drowning becomes a warning with characters, motives, and cosmic drama. The wedges on the tablet sit patiently, as if they are saying, "Yes, yes, we have been waiting for you to catch up." Still, your mind drifts to the stranger theories. Some fringe voices insist the flood is an Anunnaki intervention, a comet memory, or a coded warning about tech that went wrong. The tablet itself does not confirm any of that. It just sits there, silent, letting humans supply the drama, which, honestly, is our favorite hobby. Yet the impulse makes sense. When water rises, you want a reason you can argue with, not a random shrug from the universe. The wedges offer structure, even if the structure is divine politics, alien rumors, or plain old river chaos. You lean closer and let your eyes pretend they can read. You cannot, not tonight, unless you secretly trained as a specialist and have been hiding it from all of us. But you can imagine the sound of Akkadian, heavy and rhythmic. As a reader traces each line, it begins with a voice remembering, the way older stories always begin. With someone saying, "Listen, I've seen it." A man, sometimes called Utnapishtim in later copies, speaks of a time when the gods get loud, when the world feels too crowded, when decision-makers in the sky decide the solution is, incredibly, to flood everything. That is the kind of management style that would get you fired in a week, but divinity does not do performance reviews. On the tablet, the wedges tighten, as if the scribe's hand also feels the tension, as if the clay itself holds its breath. Behind you, an audio guide murmurs, mispronouncing something with heroic confidence. And you smile because that is also how history gets edited. The room softens, polished floor, distant footsteps, the faint smell of old paper and fresh paint. Outside, cars hiss on wet streets, and you imagine an older street, mud brick under bare feet, the river breathing in darkness. In that imagined night, the warning arrives. Not as thunder, but as a secret, a dream that leaves someone sitting upright, listening hard. You're doing the same thing now, only with better lighting and far fewer mosquitoes. As you take one last look at the wedges, you realize the tablet is not only about water, it is about noticing small marks before the big wave, and letting a story carry you, gently, toward sleep. You keep standing there like the tablet might suddenly start glowing, because your brain is convinced this is how ancient mysteries work. Spoiler, it does not glow, it just sits behind glass, being clay, which is honestly the most powerful flex in the room. You take a slow step along the display, and the museum lighting follows you in soft pools, like it also wants to hear the next part. Somewhere nearby, a school group squeaks past, and you admire how children can sprint through 5,000 years of history without tripping once. You, meanwhile, are moving like you are crossing a swamp, careful and quiet, because you can feel the story pulling you deeper. The label mentions Cuneiform, and your mind latches onto the word the way it latches onto a catchy song you did not ask for. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped, and suddenly the wedges become physical. You imagine the stylus, not a fancy pen, but a cut reed, trimmed to a point, then flattened so it can press triangles and lines. The scribe holds it at different angles, like a musician changing chords, and each angle makes a different sign. You picture the clay tablet while it is still damp, smooth as bread dough, sitting on a scribe's lap or on a low table, and you picture the scribe's fingers smeared with river mud. It is strangely intimate. Writing as touch, language as pressure. That matters because this flood story, this myth that feels enormous, is built out of tiny decisions. A scribe can press a wedge a hair too deep, or misplace a line. And 5,000 years later, you are staring at a translation and thinking the gods said one thing, when maybe they said another. Historians still argue whether some variations in flood accounts are deliberate theological shifts or simple copying errors that fossilized into canon. The thought makes you want to treat the tablet like a living thing, because in a way it is. It is a moment of someone's hand preserved in baked earth, a snapshot of attention, You drift toward a second case where tools are displayed. Replicas of reed styluses, little lumps of clay, and a half-finished practice tablet covered in messy beginner wedges. You feel an unexpected affection for the student who made it, because it looks like your first attempt at anything important. The wedges wobble, the lines tilt, and the teacher probably sighed the same way every teacher has sighed since time began. The museum calls it a school text, which is a polite way of saying ancient homework. And you love that it survived when so much else did not. In Mesopotamia, scribes are not just writers. They are accountants, diplomats, judges, magicians, and professional rememberers. Writing begins with practical needs, lists and receipts, but it quickly becomes a way to pin down the slippery stuff too: prayers, omens, epics, warnings. The mainstream historical fact hiding in plain sight is that cuneiform is one of the earliest writing systems we know, developing in ancient Mesopotamia in the late 4th millennium BCE, and then evolving across centuries into a script used for many languages. This is not just trivia. It means that when you read a flood story on a tablet, you're holding a technology that makes myth portable. You do not have to rely on one person's voice by the fire. You can bake the fire into the clay and carry it forward. And baking is the key. Some tablets are intentionally fired, turned hard so they will last. Others are just dried, meant for everyday use, and then a building burns or collapses and the heat accidentally fires them anyway, like a tragic kiln. You picture a library shelf tipping in smoke, tablets dropping and cracking, and part of you thinks, well, at least the story survived. That is a dark thing to think in a museum. So you soften it by staring at a gift shop mug that says, "Write like it's 2500 BCE, because capitalism always knows when you're getting emotional. You circle back to the flood tablet, and now you see it differently. It is not just a myth. It is a crafted object. The edges are chipped, the surface worn, and some signs are incomplete, which is the ancient version of buffering. Translators have to compare copies, fill in missing lines, argue over whether a sign is this or that, whether a break happened before or after a certain phrase. Sometimes, to be honest, they make educated guesses. That is not weakness. That is the craft. Yet it also means the flood story is partly a puzzle, a mosaic built from fragments. Historians still argue whether certain lines about the boat's dimensions in some flood texts reflect realistic engineering knowledge or symbolic numerology. You can feel the debate like a low hum under the glass, the gentle friction of experts trying to coax certainty out of clay. You lean in and imagine the original scribe copying from an older text. Maybe the scribe is working in a temple school, maybe in a palace archive, maybe late at night with an oil lamp making the shadows wiggle. The scribe's supervisor might pace behind, listening for mistakes. Because an error in a myth is not just embarrassing, it can be dangerous if the text is treated as sacred or authoritative. But of course, errors happen. People sneeze, lamps sputter, a reed tip splinters. A cat, if cats are already doing cat things, might stroll across the work surface with complete indifference to civilization. That is your second lie tonight. You are pretending you would not do the same. Now your mind wanders into the quirky corner, because you cannot resist. There are fringe tidbits about cuneiform that always pop up in late-night documentaries. Secret messages encoded in wedge patterns, star maps hidden in hymn lines, alien instructions disguised as bookkeeping. Most of it is more imagination than evidence. But the fun part is that cuneiform does include texts about omens, astronomy, and divine communication. The ancient world reads the sky like a tablet and reads the tablet like a sky. If a comet appears, If a lunar eclipse turns the moon copper red, scribes record it and attach meaning. So when flood myths describe the gods deciding to wipe things clean, you can see why some modern minds go, what if this is a cosmic event memory? It is the human pattern seeking engine revving at full speed. The tablet does not say comet, it says flood. But it also invites you to think about how people interpret disaster through the tools they have. Both mental and material, you take a slow breath and let the museum quiet wash over you. The air feels like sleep already, cool and steady. You think about meaning, about how the medium shapes the message. If the flood story is pressed into clay, then it is meant to endure, to be touched, to be stored, to be found. It is meant to outlast the teller. That alone changes the myth's power. An oral story can shift with each retelling, but a tablet freezes a version, and later versions argue with it, echo it, correct it, or rebel against it. That is why flood myths can be both stable and fluid, fixed in clay yet roaming through time. You step back from the glass, letting the tablet become small again, a dark rectangle in a lit case. You realize the flood story starts before the water ever rises. It starts with a stylus in wet clay, with someone deciding that this warning, this memory, this divine argument is worth pressing into the world. You let that thought settle like silt in calm water, and you feel yourself drifting, ready to follow the wedges into the next whisper of the tale. You wander on, but not far, because the flood story has you by the sleeve now, tugging gently like a friend who insists you must see one more thing. The museum hall narrows into a quieter corner, where the lighting is dimmer and the cases feel more private, like confession booths for ancient secrets. You can almost hear the hush of clay, the soft static of time. Your footsteps slow to that sleepy pace where you are not quite walking and not quite floating. And that is perfect, because this is where the warning arrives. In your mind, the glass dissolves and you are no longer in polished modern calm. You are in a city of mud brick and reed roofs, where the river smell never really leaves your clothes. The streets are narrow and busy, and the air is warm even at night. Someone is always selling something, shouting something, fixing something. Donkeys clop past with baskets of barley, and the noise is constant, a living blanket. Yet under that everyday bustle there is a vibration, a faint unease, like the river itself is clearing its throat. You are someone important enough to matter, but not important enough to be safe. In these flood stories, that usually means you are a king, a wise man, or a deeply competent person who has been minding your business until the cosmos decides to get involved. Sometimes your name shifts depending on the version. Atrahasis, Ziusudra, Utnapishtim. The fact that there are multiple names is not a mistake. It is the mainstream reality of ancient storytelling. Different cities, different languages, different traditions, and yet the same bone structure of the tale. Historians still argue whether these figures were once separate local heroes who later merged into a single flood survivor archetype, or whether one core story spread and then picked up regional flavors. Either way, you are now wearing the role like a borrowed cloak, and it fits you surprisingly well. Night arrives and you finally sit in your house, a courtyard space where shadows pool around jars of grain. A lamp flickers. Someone has been talking all day about omens, a dog howling wrong, a birth with strange timing, the river behaving like it has opinions. You roll your eyes because people always find patterns when they are bored. And then you feel the moment that changes everything. The air thickens, the lamp flame leans, the silence becomes deliberate, and then the warning comes, not as a shouted announcement, but as a whisper that slips around the edges of rules. In one famous Mesopotamian flood tradition, the god who warns the human does it in a clever, almost sneaky way. Because the gods have made a decision and you are not supposed to hear it. The warning is delivered through a wall, or a dream, or a coded speech that technically does not violate the divine oath of secrecy. That detail is one of those delicious, quirky tidbits that makes the story feel real, because it is exactly the kind of workaround a bureaucracy creates. We cannot tell you, the gods say, but what if we casually mention it to this reed wall, and you happen to be standing nearby? Divine loopholes. Because even immortals love a good loophole. You press your palm to the cool mud brick and listen. The voice is not human, but it knows your name. It tells you that a flood is coming, that the gods have decided to wash the world clean. The voice does not bother explaining the morality, which is rude, but consistent. It gives instructions, and it speaks with urgency that feels like thunder held back. You swallow, because you realize you're about to become the person who knows something that cannot be unsaid. This is where meaning starts twisting. The flood is not only a weather event. In myth, it is a reset button, a cosmic cleaning, a punishment, a solution to divine irritation. Some versions hint the gods are annoyed by human noise, which is both funny and terrifying, because imagine being wiped out for being too loud at night. You try not to take it personally. The story is telling you that power can be petty, and that survival sometimes depends on being quietly favored by someone with authority. You feel the weight of it like wet clothing. If you tell people, they may laugh. If they believe you, they may panic. Either way, you cannot save everyone. The warning is a gift with teeth. You wonder why you are chosen, and the answer is not clear. Maybe you are righteous. Maybe you are useful. Maybe you are simply nearby when the message slips through the wall. That uncertainty is part of the myth's tension, and historians still argue whether the flood survivor is meant to be a moral exemplar or simply a vessel for continuity, a way to preserve humanity and culture through catastrophe. Outside your courtyard, the city continues. Someone argues over the price of fish. Someone sings. Someone knocks over a jar and swears, quietly, because neighbors. You are suddenly aware of how fragile all of it is. You look at a child chasing a dog, and you feel something inside you tighten. Your mind tries to do math. How many days until the rain? How much wood? How much pitch? How much food? Your stomach drops because the instructions are not just run, they are build. The warning voice tells you to dismantle your house, to use its materials, to create a vessel. It tells you to bring life into it, seeds and animals, family and craftsmen, depending on the version. It tells you to seal it with bitumen, that thick black tar that oozes from the earth in Mesopotamia and smells like the underworld. Bitumen is real, practical, and historically used in ancient construction and waterproofing, which is your mainstream anchor for tonight. Mesopotamians did use natural bitumen in building, including for waterproofing boats and structures. The myth does not invent that out of thin air. It reaches for the materials the world already provides, then magnifies them into salvation. You stand there, staring at your own walls like they are suddenly temporary. Your house has sheltered you through heat and dust and small storms, and now you are meant to rip it apart. That is the first joke your sleepy brain offers up, because it cannot cope. Imagine telling your partner, "Good news, we are doing a home renovation." Bad news, it is because the gods are flooding everything. You can already hear the reply. "Sure, and I suppose the reed wall told you this." You almost laugh, but the lamp flame still leans, and the air still feels wrong. So you choose silence, at least at first. You become secretive. which is how people always look when they are trying to save the world in plain sight. You begin gathering materials. You hire workers under the excuse of building a great boat for trade, or for a festival, or for a king. You speak carefully, because words have edges. You notice the sky more than you used to. You notice the river's mood. You notice how the wind tastes, like dust with a hint of metal. And all the while, the whisper stays in your ear. Build, build, build. You return, in a blink, to the museum glass. Your reflection overlays the tablet, your face ghosting over wedges pressed by a hand long gone. You realize that on this clay, the warning is already preserved. The whispered message is now a public artifact. The irony is almost sweet. The gods tried to keep a secret, and humans baked it into clay and put it under spotlights for tourists. That is the second joke, and it is gentle. Divine confidentiality agreements really do not survive archaeology. You exhale slowly. The warning is not yet the flood, but it is the moment everything changes. It is the moment you are no longer just living, you are preparing, and preparation, in myth and in life, is where fear turns into action and action turns into story. You feel your eyelids grow heavier, as if the whisper is not only ancient but soothing now, guiding you forward to the next inevitable step, where instructions become blueprints in moonlight. You do not sleep yet. Not fully, because the warning has turned you into a person with a plan, and plans are loud inside the skull, even in the museum. Your mind keeps building. You pace one slow loop around the case, and the tablet's wedges start to feel less like writing and more like measurements. The story slides forward without asking permission, and suddenly you are back in that river city, where night air clings to your skin and the moon sits above the rooftops like a watcher who knows too much. You begin with the first impossible task, her making the warning look normal. You cannot say, "Hello, neighbors, the gods are doing a full reset." That is how you get laughed at, arrested, or invited to a very long conversation with people who enjoy tying knots. So you borrow the language of everyday life. You say you are building a vessel for commerce. You say you are building something for the king. You say you are building a big boat because you had a dream about profit, not doom. It is funny how often people accept a ridiculous project as long as you call it investment. That is your first joke tonight. And it is painfully modern. Announce the apocalypse and everyone panics. Announce a startup and everyone asks how they can get in early. The instructions you received are odd, and that oddness is exactly why this part is so famous. In some Mesopotamian versions, the boat is described as a giant cube or a vessel with equal length and width, a shape that makes you blink and go, "Wait, are we building a boat or a very damp house?" Other versions describe it differently, more like a conventional long vessel. Historians still argue whether the cube description is symbolic, representing cosmic order and stability, or whether it reflects a specific type of large coracle-like structure imagined at mythic scale. Either way, you are not getting a tidy set of IKEA instructions with cheerful drawings. You're getting divine bullet points delivered through a wall, which is, frankly, not ideal. So you improvise with reverence and panic. You gather wood, reeds, rope. You gather bitumen, that black, sticky pitch that comes from the earth like it is oozing out a secret. It clings to your hands and smells sharp, almost sweet, like smoke and minerals. You smear it on planks until the seams disappear. You tell yourself you are sealing hope into the cracks. This is where a mainstream historical fact slips into the story again. Mesopotamia really does have natural bitumen deposits, and ancient peoples used bitumen as a sealant, including for boats and waterproofing. The myth makes practical sense in that way. grounding its miracle in materials people actually know. The divine instruction is wild, but the solution is human, sticky, and real. Workers arrive, because every great project needs people who do not ask too many questions. Some of them are carpenters, some are reed weavers, some are just strong backs who want their daily ration of beer and bread. Yes, beer, because that is the ancient labor contract in a nutshell. You pay them, you feed them, you keep them busy. They hammer, lash, weave, and smear pitch. The sound of building becomes the city's new background music, and at first everyone is curious. They gather at a distance, squinting at the structure rising from the ground. What is it? Someone asks. A boat, you say, with the confidence of a person who has decided to survive. They laugh. A boat that big. For what river? You shrug. For the future. They think you are being poetic, which is the best kind of misunderstanding. Moonlight turns the half-built frame into a skeleton. The ribs of the vessel catch silver, and the shadows between them look like dark water waiting. You climb the scaffolding and stand up high, and for a moment you can see over the roofs to where the river curls through the land like a thick ribbon. You imagine it swelling, swallowing the banks, swallowing streets. You swallow hard. The warning voice returns in fragments, like a teacher who expects you to remember the lesson. Make it strong. Make it tight. Bring in life. Do not delay. You repeat the phrases like a mantra, and every time you do, your hands move faster. There is a strange tenderness in this frantic construction. You are building a thing meant to hold breath when the world cannot. You are creating a small, floating pocket of order. In mythic terms, you are building a miniature universe, and that is probably why some versions emphasize symmetry and exactness. The boat is not merely transport. It is a boundary between destruction and continuity. This is also where the fringe tidbit creeps in, because it always does. Some modern fringe interpretations insist the boat is not a boat at all, but a sealed capsule, a survival pod designed for something bigger than rain, a tidal wave from a celestial event, a pole shift, an engineered catastrophe. People point to the sealed pitch, the precise measurements, the instructions to preserve seed of all living things, and they hear the language of a bunker. The tablet does not say spaceship, and you do not need it to. What matters is that humans, then and now, keep returning to the same fear. That disaster is not random, that someone somewhere might be choosing it, and that survival requires design. You descend from the scaffolding and wipe bitumen from your forearm. It smears, like you are wearing the night itself. A worker hands you a cup of beer, and you drink because you need something ordinary in your mouth. The beer is thick and warm, and you pretend it is delicious because everyone else is pretending too. That is your second joke. Ancient beer is basically bread in liquid form, and you are pretty sure your teeth are chewing it. Days pass in the story, but they pass like slow waves. The frame becomes a hull. The hull becomes walls. The walls become compartments. You carve out spaces for grain, for tools, for water jars, for sleeping. You think about the smell of animals, and your face tightens. But you keep going. You're building not only against drowning, but against hunger and cold and boredom. The gods may send the water, but you still have to pack the snacks. Meanwhile, the city starts telling stories about you, because cities do that. Some say you are crazy. Some say you are blessed. Some say you are planning to steal the king's treasure and flee. Rumors are like little floods of their own, spreading through mouths, soaking into minds. You let them. A good rumor is camouflage. At night, you lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the distant creak of the growing vessel. The wind shifts and brings a smell from the river, damp and heavy. You listen for thunder, but there is none yet. That waiting is its own torment. Historians still argue whether the flood narratives reflect an older genre of divine judgment story, common in the ancient Near East, or whether they preserve a uniquely Mesopotamian memory shaped by the region's river ecology. You do not know the academic answer. You only know the feeling of being warned and having to keep living as if you were not. One evening, the warning voice comes again, sharper, more urgent. It tells you the time is close. It tells you to load the vessel. It tells you to bring your family. It tells you to bring craftsmen, depending on the version. Because survival is not only about bodies, it is about skills. You picture the world after water, quiet and empty. Who will rebuild? Who will plant? Who will heal? The myth understands something that feels very modern. Disaster is not just an event. It is a long after. You walk through your courtyard and look at your house walls, already partially dismantled. Their bricks reused in ramps and supports. You feel the ache of loss before the loss arrives. You touch a doorway and remember laughter, meals, arguments, ordinary life. Then you turn away, because nostalgia is heavy and you have weight limits. Back in the museum, you are still standing, still breathing, still safe. But the tablet's wedges now feel like the blueprint of your own heartbeat. Press, 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 measure, seal, repeat. You imagine the scribe recording these instructions, perhaps from older oral lines, perhaps from another tablet now lost. Each wedge is a step in the build, each line a plank, each break in the clay, a missing board you have to replace with imagination. You glance around the hall and see modern emergency exit signs, little green icons running toward safety. You almost laugh, softly, because humans never stop making evacuation plans. We just switch from bitumen to fluorescent plastic. That is your third joke. And it is gentle. If the gods sent a flood today, someone would still insist the real problem is that you did not follow the posted safety procedures. You take one more slow breath, and you feel the story leaning toward the next edge. The vessel is built. The moon has watched. The city has gossiped. The pitch has dried like black skin. Now comes the part where signs gather in the air, where the storm starts forming before it ever drops rain. You let your shoulders relax, because the building is done and the waiting is about to end. You notice it first in the ordinary places, which is how dread always arrives. Not with a trumpet, but with a slight wrongness in the background. Like the world has shifted 1 millimeter and nobody can explain why their bones feel itchy. The vessel is finished now, looming near the river like a dark, sealed promise. Bitumen has dried in thick seams, glossy under sunlight, dull under dust. It smells like burned earth, and when the wind hits it just right, the scent carries through the streets and makes people wrinkle their noses. You tell yourself it is just pitch. You tell yourself you are just building. You tell yourself, repeatedly, because you have to. The city keeps doing city things. Bakers slap dough. Potters spin clay. Someone yells about missing goats. Someone else yells back because the goats were never missing. They were simply living their best goat life. You stand in the market and buy grain like nothing is about to happen. You nod politely at neighbors. You laugh at a joke that is not funny. Your smile feels like a mask made of reeds. And yet, signs pile up. The river is the first to act strange. It is not only high or low, it is moody. One day it runs fast, brown and thick, carrying branches that look like drowned fingers. Another day it looks almost still, as if it is holding itself back. Fishermen complain that the fish are not biting. Children toss stones and watch ripples move in a way that feels too wide. You taste the air and there is extra dampness in it. Like the sky is already sweating. You know about omens because everyone knows about omens here. The ancient world is an omen machine. A sheep's liver gets examined like it is a divine email inbox. A crack in a wall can be a message. A bird's flight can be a sentence. This is not just superstition. It is an entire system of interpreting uncertainty. The mainstream historical fact tucked in here is that Mesopotamians practiced divination extensively, including reading celestial events and interpreting animal entrails. And scribes recorded omen series that tried to map meaning onto chaos. In a world where floods can erase your harvest, you cling to patterns the way you cling to a rope in fast water. So when the signs start stacking, people notice. A dog howls all night in the same spot, facing the river, and refuses to stop. Someone says the dog sees spirits. Someone else says the dog has fleas and needs a bath. The debate gets heated, because humans can fight about anything, even canine despair. That is your first joke tonight. Whisper to yourself as you pass by. The apocalypse could be arriving, and the neighborhood committee would still argue about whether the dog is being dramatic. A priest announces a ritual cleansing. A merchant burns extra incense. A mother ties a charm around her child's wrist. A farmer mutters a prayer into the soil before planting, like the earth might answer. You watch all of it with a strange double vision. Part of you is inside the culture, respecting the gestures, and part of you is outside, holding the secret that the water is not symbolic this time, or maybe it is both. That is the slippery thing about myth. Even when it describes real fear, it also describes meaning layered on top of fear, like silt settling over stone. Historians still argue whether the flood story's divine decision is meant as moral judgment, as a mythic explanation for natural disaster, or as a political metaphor about kingship and cosmic order. You can feel those interpretations brushing against you as you move through the city. When the powerful decide something, everyone downstream feels it first. When the sky decides something, the river follows. You return to the vessel each evening, checking seams, checking ropes, checking the doors and plugs and shutters. You run your hand over the pitch and it feels smooth, slightly tacky, like a wound that has healed but still remembers. Inside, the compartments wait. Jars sit packed with grain. Tools are stacked, bundles of reeds for bedding, bundles of rope for repairs. Small objects you could not leave behind, a carved figurine, a seal stone, a family cup with a chip in it that you love anyway. You're not only packing survival, you're packing identity. The animals are the hardest part, because animals do not care about your cosmic schedule. They do not line up neatly with their paperwork. You bring in goats and sheep, birds in woven cages, maybe larger beasts depending on the version your mind is wearing tonight. Some texts emphasize seed of all living things, which might mean literal animals, or it might mean the essential beginnings, the potential. Historians still argue whether seed in these flood accounts should be read strictly as biological specimens or more broadly as the cultural and agricultural means to restart life. Either way, you can already smell the future inside the vessel, and it smells like hay, fear, and decisions. Meanwhile, people watch you. The gossip never stops. It just changes tone. At first it is amused, then it is curious, then it becomes uneasy. Someone asks you directly why you're doing this. You smile and give a safe answer. You mention trade. You mention a festival. You mention the king. You do not mention the wall whisper. You do not mention the gods. You do not mention the flood. You feel like you are holding your breath underwater and pretending you are fine. The sky starts to change. Clouds gather in the distance. Not yet storm clouds, more like bruises spreading slowly. The mornings feel dimmer. The sun looks pale, as if it is tired. The wind shifts direction and brings a chill at odd times, like the season has gotten confused. You stand on your roof one night and watch the horizon. Lightning flickers far away, silent like a threat not yet spoken aloud. This is where the fringed tidbit slides in, soft as a rumor. Some people, then and now, interpret these signs not as weather but as cosmic disturbance. They talk about strange skies, abnormal winds, the sun dimming, as if a volcanic eruption or an impact event could be behind it. The ancient texts do not give you a scientific report. They give you a mood, and moods can be interpreted in many directions. The myth tells you the sky's angry. The modern mind asks what physical event could make the sky feel angry. The truth might be a river flood amplified by regional climate, or it might be a narrative shaped by generations. But in your body, in the story, it feels immediate. It feels like the air is thickening around your ribs. One evening, the warning voice returns one last time. It does not whisper through the wall now so much as vibrate inside your thoughts. It tells you the day has come. It tells you to enter the vessel. It tells you to shut the door. It tells you to trust the seal. The pitch. The plan. You gather your family. Their faces are lit by lamplight, eyes wide, mouths tight. They do not fully understand. Or maybe they do and they are too afraid to speak it. You guide them toward the vessel with the calm of someone trying not to shake. Behind you, the city continues to murmur, unaware of how thin the future has become. You feel an ache in your chest that is part guilt, part grief, part urgency. You want to yell. You want to warn. You want to pull strangers by the sleeve and say, "Please, please, come." But the myth has set its boundary. The warning was private. The boat is limited. The door will close. You step up the ramp into the vessel's mouth. Inside, it is dim, the air already warm and heavy. The animals shift and snort. Someone coughs. A lantern flame quivers. You hear rain begin as a faint tapping on the roof. So soft at first you think it might be dust. Then it becomes steadier, a rhythmic patter, like fingers drumming on wood. Outside, someone laughs in the street. Maybe at a joke, maybe at you. The sound is normal, and that normality is almost unbearable. You hold the edge of the door and hesitate, because closing it feels like sealing a tomb and a cradle at the same time. You look back at the city one last time, at the silhouettes of roofs, at the thin smoke rising from cooking fires, at life happening like it always does. Then you shut the door, the latch clunks, and the sound is final. The lantern inside becomes the only sun you have. The rain grows louder, heavier, as if the sky is moving furniture around. You press your ear to the wood and hear the first true roar in the distance. The storm is no longer waiting. Back in the museum, your reflection trembles over the tablet's wedges. You realize this is the hinge moment, the moment right before the flood becomes undeniable. The world outside is still there, but it is about to be rewritten by water. Your breathing slows, heavy and steady, like rain on a sealed roof, and you drift toward the next section where the argument of the storm finally begins. The rain starts like a suggestion and becomes an opinion. At first it is polite, tapping on the roof of the vessel in scattered drops, as if the sky is testing whether you are paying attention. Then it thickens into a steady drumming, 1,000 fingers working in unison. The sound fills the darkness inside, and for a moment you almost think it is soothing, like a fan humming at bedtime. Then the pitch changes. The taps become slaps. The slaps become a roar. The sky stops asking and starts taking. Inside the vessel, Everyone listens. You hear the animals shifting, hooves scraping wood, feathers rustling in cramped cages. You hear a child whimper and get hushed. You hear an older relative muttering a prayer under their breath, the words repeating like a rocking motion. The lantern flame wobbles with every gust that presses against the walls. The air tastes of wet pitch and warm breath. You realize quickly that a sealed refuge has its own weather. Heat rises, smells gather, and every sound becomes louder because there is nowhere for it to escape. Outside, the city's normal noises vanish under the storm. The market cries, the donkey brays, the distant laughter. All of it is swallowed by water pounding earth. You picture streets turning into channels, courtyards filling like bowls, brick walls drinking too much and crumbling. The myth does not linger on gore, but it does linger on enormity. Water does not have to be violent to be unstoppable. It just has to keep coming. The flood, in these ancient stories, is not just a storm. It is the god's decision made physical. That is what makes it feel like an argument. Rain becomes a statement. Wind becomes a verdict. The world is being corrected. In the divine mind, like wiping a tablet clean. And yes, that image is not accidental. The people who wrote and copied these myths lived with clay tablets. They knew what it meant to smooth wet clay and start over. The flood is the cosmic version of that gesture. Erase, repress, begin again. The mainstream historical fact you carry into this moment is simple and heavy. Mesopotamia's river plains are prone to severe flooding, and ancient settlements built along waterways faced real, recurring flood risks. The myth is not made from nothing. It is a magnification of lived anxiety. When you live on a flat plain with powerful rivers, water is never only water. It is always a memory of what it can do. The vessel shudders, not from waves yet, but from wind. The roof creaks like an old door. Ropes tighten. Someone whispers, "Is it holding?" And you answer without looking, because if you look at the seams, you might see your own fear reflected there. "It is holding," you say, as if certainty is a tool you can hand out. The rain intensifies again. You start to hear something else underneath it, a rising, rushing sound like an ocean approaching, the river, the streets, the earth itself releasing water as if the ground cannot keep swallowing. The sound builds and builds until it feels like the world has turned into one giant waterfall. The vessel begins to rock, gently at first, then more insistently. The floor tilts under your feet. An animal bleats in protest. A jar clinks against another jar and you flinch, because every small noise feels like a crack. Here is where the story's symbolism and its terror braid together. The flood is cleansing, sure, but it is also chaos. In Mesopotamian thought, order is fragile and must be maintained through ritual, kingship, and divine favor. Water, especially uncontrolled water, can represent the primeval chaos that existed before creation was organized. So when the flood comes, it is not only punishment, it is the world slipping back toward the formless. Historians still argue whether the flood motif in Mesopotamian literature is primarily an ethical tale about divine judgment or a cosmological tale about order versus chaos. Sitting in the dim lantern light, you can feel both. You are physically threatened, and you are existentially unsettled. The vessel lifts. It is a slow sensation at first, like a rug being pulled under you. The floor no longer feels anchored. The sounds change, too. The rain is still loud, but now you hear waves slapping against the sides. The vessel creaks in a new way, a floating way. Someone gasps, and then someone laughs. A short, nervous burst, because laughter is what humans do when reality shifts and they cannot find the right emotion fast enough. That is your first joke tonight. Made silently to yourself. Congratulations. You have invented the world's worst cruise, with zero entertainment and unlimited goat smell. The rocking becomes steady. The vessel is afloat. You brace yourself against a beam. Your hand sticks slightly where pitch has seeped. The air feels thinner, though you know it is only your nerves. Outside, the storm rages. The myth often describes it as overwhelming even the gods, as if the divine decision is so extreme that the decision-makers regret it midway. Some versions include gods cowering, weeping, hungry because there are no offerings, realizing they have cut off their own sustenance. That detail is one of the most human things about these ancient stories. The gods are powerful, but not always wise. They make big choices and then discover consequences. Like someone rage-quitting a group chat and then realizing they still need the Wi-Fi password. That is your second joke. And it is almost affectionate. The divine council, apparently, could use a nap and a snack. This is also where the quirky or fringe tidbit glides into the dark, because storms invite speculation. In some retellings and modern interpretations, people point out that flood myths across cultures might preserve memories of sea level rise after the last ice age, or of catastrophic regional floods like massive river outbursts. Others go further and propose sudden events, comet impacts, ancient engineering failures, or deliberate interventions. You, inside this vessel, do not have a graph or a satellite image. You have sensation. You have the sound of the sky ripping itself open, whatever the cause. The myth wants you to feel the helplessness of being a small thing inside a huge force. And that feeling is universal enough that people keep attaching new explanations to it. Hours pass, or days, and time becomes sloppy, without sun or stars. You measure time by lantern oil, by hunger, by the rhythm of the storm. Sometimes the rocking is gentle, almost hypnotic. Sometimes it slams hard, throwing you into a beam and making your shoulder ache. You check the seams. You listen for dripping. You do not hear it, and you thank every wedge you pressed into clay, every rope you tied, every smear of pitch. You whisper to the vessel like it is a living companion. Hold, you think. Hold. At some point, the sound outside changes again. The rain is still present, but the wind takes on a higher pitch, like it is screaming through narrow spaces. The vessel spins slowly, and you feel seasick in the dark, which is a uniquely humiliating way to meet divine apocalypse. That is your third joke tonight. Because you cannot resist. Imagine surviving the end of the world only to lose the battle with your own stomach. The gods would be so offended you made it about nausea. Someone vomits anyway, and everyone pretends not to notice. Because politeness is one of the last things humans cling to when everything else is dissolving. You sit down against a stack of bundles and close your eyes. The lantern light paints orange shadows on the walls. The sounds of animals blend with the storm until it becomes a thick lullaby of survival. You think about the city. You think about the people who never got a warning. You think about the wall whisper and the door closing. Guilt moves through you like a slow current. But you cannot undo it now. The myth does not offer easy comfort. It offers continuity. It says, something will remain, and behind that, a quieter meaning begins to form. The flood is not only destruction, it is a test of preparation, of trust, of building something before you can prove you need it. It is the idea that knowledge, once received, demands action. Historians still argue whether the flood survivor figure is meant to model obedience to divine instruction or cleverness in navigating divine politics. Maybe it is both. Maybe survival is always a blend of compliance and cunning. The storm continues, relentless, until your body stops trying to track it and begins to accept it as the new world. Your breathing slows, your muscles soften, the vessel rocks, and in that rocking you find a strange cradle. The argument of rain and wind is still outside, but inside, in the dim warm dark, the story wraps around you like a blanket made of old clay and whispered warnings. You drift, afloat between fear and sleep, moving toward the moment when the storm finally tires and the world's roar begins to fade. You wake inside the floating dark without fully waking. The way you sometimes resurface from sleep just enough to know you exist, then sink again. The vessel rocks in a slower rhythm now, less like a fight and more like a long, weary sway. The storm is still there, but it has changed texture. It sounds farther away, as if the sky is breathing through a thick blanket. You blink in the lantern glow and see the same cramped shapes, ropes hanging like sleepy vines, jars lined up like silent guards, bundles stacked like exhausted shoulders. Everything smells alive and sealed. Pitch, damp wood, animal warmth, human breath. Inside, the world has shrunk. There is no horizon, no street, no neighbor. There is only the interior of survival. That is what disaster does. It makes you small. It turns you into a creature counting resources and listening to walls. You shift your weight, and the plank under you answers with a soft creak. It is not a threatening creak, more like a tired old sigh. The vessel is speaking in its own language, and you are learning to interpret it the way scribes interpret wedges. A high creak might mean the rope needs tightening. The dull thud might mean a jar shifted. A sudden silence might mean something is wrong, because silence in a cramped space is rarely peaceful. You sit and listen, and you realize you have become a kind of scribe of sound, pressing meaning into noise. Someone across the dark whispers your name. You respond softly. People here have started speaking in half voices, as if loudness might offend the vessel or wake the storm. The animals are mostly quiet too, which surprises you. Even goats know when the world is serious. A bird rustles in its cage and then settles, feathers brushing reed. In the dim light, eyes shine back at you, human eyes, animal eyes, all reflecting the same small flame. It is strange, this shared captivity. You are a little floating community, a tiny city with no streets. You check the lantern oil, the water jars, the grain. You do the practical things because practical things anchor you. In some versions of the flood story, there are descriptions of how long the storm lasts. 7 days, 6 days, and 7 nights. Numbers that feel symbolic as much as literal. Historians still argue whether these durations are meant to reflect actual remembered storm cycles, or whether they are stylized numbers chosen for their cultural resonance. Inside your vessel, time is not numbers. Time is hunger. Time is the moment when the lantern flame shrinks and you feel panic rise with it. The vessel bumps against something. At first you think it is a wave slamming, but the sound is different, a dull contact, then a sliding scrape. Everyone freezes. A child clutches a sleeve. An animal snorts. You hold your breath and listen. Another bump. Softer. Then nothing. Debris, you tell yourself. Roof beams, tree trunks, baskets, the disassembled pieces of a city. The idea is unbearable. So your mind tries to make it abstract. Floating objects, natural drift. It is only wood meeting wood. You whisper inside. Only the river moving furniture around. The rocking continues. Sometimes it is gentle enough that you can almost pretend you are on a peaceful boat ride, the kind where someone offers you fruit in a view. But then a wave hits and the vessel tilts and jars clink and the animals protest, and you remember. You are not sightseeing. You are waiting for the world to decide it is done drowning. In the dim, you begin to talk more, because silence leaves too much room for the mind to spiral. You tell stories to the others, simple ones, memories of ordinary days, a festival, a harvest, a funny argument over a goat that refused to walk. You make the story of the flood compete with smaller stories, because that is how you keep your humanity from being washed away. That is your first joke tonight, murmured as you recall the goat. Even at the end of the world, goats stay committed to being impossible. If they ever form a government, you are all doomed. People laugh softly, and the laughter sounds like a crack of light in the dark. You realize how precious it is. The myth may be ancient, but it understands this. Community matters, even when the sky's falling. In some Mesopotamian versions, the flood survivor brings not only family, but craftsmen. Because after the catastrophe, you need people who know how to rebuild. That is a mainstream historical insight embedded in the myth's logic. Ancient societies valued specialized labor and organized work. And the preservation of skills would be crucial after any disaster. The story is not just about saving bodies. It is about saving the ability to make a world. You move through the compartments, checking on animals, checking on people. The cramped air sticks to your skin. You wipe sweat from your forehead and it smells faintly of pitch. You notice the way the lantern light makes shadows dance, turning rope loops into snakes, turning beams into looming figures. Your mind plays tricks because it is bored and scared. You catch yourself staring at a knot as if it might speak. And then, in the quietest part of the night, it feels like the gods are near, not as thunder now, but as an uneasy presence, like being watched. In some flood narratives, the gods are divided. One wants to destroy, another wants to preserve. Some regret, some justify. The divine world is political, full of councils and arguments. That is one of the most revealing things about these myths. They mirror human institutions. The gods sound like kings and advisors, like bureaucrats with cosmic power. Historians still argue whether this depiction reflects actual ancient political realities, projecting royal councils into the heavens, or whether it is a literary device to explain why the universe can be both cruel and merciful. You do not have the luxury of theory. You feel the division as a tension in the air, as if the storm itself is the echo of a debate you were never invited to. You sit near the sealed door and press your palm to it, the way you once pressed your palm to the wall that whispered. The wood is wet on the outside but dry on the inside, which feels like a miracle. You whisper a thank you to no one in particular. Then you whisper something else, something selfish. Let it end. The vessel drifts. The sound of rain fades a little more, replaced by the slap of water. That change is subtle but significant. It is like the storm is pulling back its fist. You listen hard. You think you hear birds outside, but it might be your imagination, your mind trying to summon normal life. You close your eyes and picture a mountain peak, a hill, anything that could be above the water. Your imagination is a little desperate, and desperation makes pictures vivid. The fringe tidbit slips in here like a dream fragment. Some modern storytellers love to imagine the inside of the flood vessel as a kind of time capsule, preserving genetic material, storing knowledge, carrying the blueprint of civilization. They talk about sacred texts and advanced wisdom hidden aboard. The ancient tablets do not list a library inventory, but the concept is not entirely modern. The idea of preserving seed, preserving essentials, preserving continuity is already there. You can feel the vessel as an archive, not only of living creatures, but of the old world's memory. Every jar, every tool, Every small carved object is a line of cuneiform in physical form. At one point, someone asks you, very quietly, "How long?" You answer honestly, which is to say, you do not answer with certainty. "Until the water stops," you say. "Until the world is ready." That is not comforting. So you add, "And until we run out of patience." That is your second joke, dry as dust. It gets a weak laugh. Weak laughs are still laughs. The days blur again. You ration food. You ration lantern oil. You tell people to breathe slowly when panic rises, because panic wastes air. You listen to the vessel's creaks like a lullaby. You notice the way your thoughts start moving slower, the way your body adjusts to the constant rocking. Humans adapt in frighteningly efficient ways. You can get used to almost anything, even floating in darkness while the world drowns. Then, finally, there is a quiet that feels different. Not the quiet of a pause, but the quiet of an ending. The rain becomes a memory. The wind becomes a distant sigh. The vessel still floats, but the waves soften. Everyone notices, because everyone has been listening for this moment. The lantern flames steady. Someone exhales like they have been holding their breath for days, which they kind of have. You sit up straighter. Your heart thumps, not with fear now, but with a cautious hope. The flood has not ended. Not yet, but the storm has loosened its grip. In the darkness, you imagine the sky clearing, clouds tearing open, sunlight spilling onto endless water. You imagine the world, rinsed and raw, waiting, and you realize the next step is not waiting. It is testing. It is sending something small into the air to ask the biggest question. Is there land? Is there mercy? Is there a place for us to begin again? You open your eyes, and in the lantern glow you can almost see the outline of a bird cage, waiting like a punctuation mark in the story. Your fingers curl around the idea of it, and you drift toward the moment when wings will carry your hope into the bright unknown. You move toward the bird cages as if the air itself is guiding you. The vessel is quieter now, rocking in that slow, syrupy rhythm that makes your eyelids heavy. But your mind stays alert because this is the moment where a small thing decides the fate of everyone. It is almost unfair. Really. You survive divine rain, you outlast the roar, and then you have to trust a bird with navigation. That is your first joke tonight. Whispered to yourself in the dim, the whole plan is ask the pigeon, which is either genius or the worst idea in human history. The lantern light catches the woven reeds of the cages, and you hear soft rustling inside. The birds are restless, sensing the change in pressure, the shift in sound, the new space opening in the world. You take a slow breath and listen through a crack in the vessel's upper hatch. The air that slips in is cooler and smells different. Less wet wood, more open water, a hint of clean sky. It feels like the planet has taken a shower and is now standing there dripping, unsure what to wear. You climb to the hatch. Careful with each step. Your hand finds a rope, your foot finds a beam, and your body remembers the vessel's map by feel. You unlatch the opening just enough. Light spills in. Not bright sunlight yet, but a gray, diffused glow like dawn behind thick cloud. Your eyes sting. You blink hard, because you have been living in lantern orange for too long. Outside is a sheet of water stretching in every direction, rippling under a sky that still looks bruised. The horizon is soft, blurred, like the world forgot to render fully. You lift the first bird. Different versions of the flood tale use different birds, and that detail has become one of the most delicious points of comparison. In the later epic of Gilgamesh flood account, for example, the survivor releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. In other traditions, you might see variations in order and species. Historians still argue whether these differences reflect regional bird symbolism, scribal preference, or independent storytelling streams that later braided together. For you, in the moment, it is simpler. You have a bird, and you have a question. Is there land? You open your hands. The bird shoots upward, wings beating hard, then circles. Confused by the endless water, it becomes a small dark comma against the gray sky. You watch until your eyes blur. The bird circles again, then returns, landing on the vessel with the irritated energy of a messenger who has no message. It hops, shakes water off its feathers, and looks at you like you are responsible for the state of the world, which, to be fair, you kind of are. At least in the myth's logic. You take that as data. No land yet, or land too far, or the bird is dramatic. It is always hard to tell. Time slides. The vessel drifts. The water laps at the sides with a gentler sound now, like someone smoothing a bedspread. You close the hatch to keep the inside warm, and you go back down to ration food, to soothe nerves, to pretend you're not counting the minutes in your head. The people inside ask you what you saw. You say, water, and everyone nods because that is both obvious and somehow still shocking. Then you try again. This time, the bird's wings look steadier. The sky has a slightly brighter seam to the east, like the clouds are thinning. You open the hatch, and the air that enters carries a faint scent that makes your stomach twist with longing. Earth, it is subtle, almost imaginary, but it is there. Wet clay, distant reeds, something not water. You lift the cage and feel the bird quiver inside. You open it. The bird flies out. It circles wider. It disappears for a longer stretch. Your heart thumps like a drum in your chest. You listen for the return, for the scratch of claws on wood, for the flutter, and then it comes back again. It lands, tired, and you feel both relief and disappointment. Relief that the bird survived. Disappointment that the world is still all water. That is the second joke tonight, and it is bittersweet. You have invented a very ancient version of refreshing the page, and the page keeps loading the same thing. You sit back and let the lantern light warm your face. You remember, suddenly, that this bird sequence is not only practical, it is symbolic. Birds are liminal creatures. They belong to air. They touch earth. They skim water. They are perfect messengers between realms. In a flood myth, where realms have been scrambled, a bird becomes the scout, the question mark, the hope with feathers. It is also the part of the story that makes people argue the most, because it is so specific. Scholars compare lines, compare species names, compare tablet fragments. They debate whether the Akkadian terms map neatly to modern species, or whether translation choices shape the whole scene. Historians still argue whether some bird names in these texts should be translated as swallow or another small bird, and whether that changes the symbolism. You love that humans can argue for centuries about a bird while the ocean is still outside, because that is what we do. We cling to details. You wait. You conserve oil. You speak softly to keep everyone calm. You remind them that water recedes, that storms end, that even gods eventually get tired. Someone asks if the gods will be angry that you survived. You say, they were angry before, which is not comforting, but it is honest. You add, maybe they will be too busy regretting everything. That gets a tiny laugh. Tiny laughs are your new currency. Then, when the light outside looks almost like real daylight and not just gray, you try the last bird. In the version many people know best, it is the raven that does not return. The raven goes out, finds something, and stays away. Because ravens are practical and opportunistic, and if there is food or land, they do not feel obligated to update you. That detail is both hilarious and oddly plausible. It is also one of those mainstream anchors that makes the story feel grounded. If you have ever met a crow, you know it would absolutely abandon you for a snack. That is your third joke tonight. Soft and affectionate. The raven does not come back because it has found a new job and you are no longer its manager. You open the cage. The bird launches into the brighter air. It circles once, twice, then flies in a straight line towards something you cannot see, yet it becomes a dot, then nothing. You wait, eyes burning. Minutes pass, then more. The bird does not return. A hush falls over the vessel that is deeper than any storm hush. People stop moving. Even the animals seem to sense it, going quiet in the straw. You feel hope rise, terrifyingly. Because hope is dangerous, hope can break your heart. But it also gives you strength. You climb to the hatch again and stare out, and then you see it. Not a mountain yet, not a dramatic peak, but something interrupting the endless water. A darker line, a cluster of reeds, a piece of land or floating debris that is not moving like debris. It holds. It sits. It exists. The water around it ripples differently, like it is meeting resistance. You inhale sharply and taste air that has more than moisture in it. It tastes like dust and plants and possibility. You close your eyes and let the relief wash through you. The flood is not gone, but it is changing. The world is reassembling. The vessel has done its job. Now it must find somewhere to rest. This is where interpretation shifts again. Some read the bird test as pure practicality. Others read it as ritual, a symbolic negotiation with the elements. Historians still argue whether the bird sequence is a literary motif borrowed and refined across versions, or whether it reflects an older, perhaps real practice among boatmen using birds to locate land after floods. There is no single answer that will satisfy everyone. The clay is old, the water is a metaphor and memory. The birds are both. You sit back down in the lantern glow and feel your body sink into the new calm. Outside, the sky is lighter. Inside, people whisper. Not with fear now, but with cautious excitement. The animals stir. You hear someone quietly thanking the gods, and someone else quietly cursing them, and you think, yes, that is about right. Gratitude and resentment can share the same mouth. You look at the sealed door, at the pitch lines, at the ropes, and you realize you are approaching the next threshold. Soon you will open the vessel fully. Soon you will step onto whatever the water has left behind. Soon you will find out what after feels like. For now, you let the image of the bird flying away stay in your mind like a slow-moving star. You breathe in. You breathe out. The vessel drifts toward land, and the story drifts toward silence, where the first sound of your footsteps on new earth will matter more than thunder ever did. You do not rush the landing, even though every muscle in your body wants to sprint straight through the hatch and kiss the first patch of dirt like it is a celebrity. The vessel drifts with the slow patience of something that has carried too much weight for too long. Outside, the sky is finally lighter, not cheerful, but less hostile. The clouds still hang like damp blankets, yet thin seams of pale blue peek through, and that blue feels almost sacred. You keep the hatch open a little wider now, letting fresh air spill into the cramped interior. It smells like wet reeds, mud, and something green trying to remember how to be alive. The first time the vessel scrapes ground, it is so soft you think it might be your imagination. A gentle shudder, A dragging sound. The hull settles, then lifts again as a small wave nudges it. People freeze, listening. Then it scrapes again. Longer this time, and you feel it in your bones. Land, not just a rumor, not just a bird's opinion. Actual resistance. You grip a rope and steady yourself. The vessel leans slightly. The animals shift, sensing the change. Someone whispers, "Is it safe?" And you are tempted to answer, "Nothing is safe, ever." But you decide to be kind. "Safer," you say. Enough. That is the strange truth of after. It is never clean. It is never complete. It is simply enough to step forward. You unlatch the main door. The pitch seal cracks with a soft, sticky sound, like a bandage being peeled. Light floods in, and everyone squints, blinking like newborns. You step out first, because the myth expects you to, because leadership is mostly just being the person who touches the scary thing first. Your feet meet wood, then damp air, then the ramp, and finally the first touch of ground. It is mud. Of course it is mud. You were hoping for heroic, solid earth. Instead you get squelch. Your foot sinks a little and pulls back with a sucking sound that is deeply unglamorous. That is your first joke tonight, whispered to yourself as you balance. You survive divine annihilation, and your reward is stepping into the world's biggest puddle. Nature really knows how to humble you. But the mud is still a miracle. You look around. Water stretches out in all directions, but not as high, not as angry. In the distance, you see shapes that rise above it. Hills, maybe the edge of a mountain, maybe a ridge. The land you have reached is not lush. It is rinsed. It looks bruised, scraped clean, like the world has been sanded down. Debris lies in strange patterns, reeds tangled in branches, broken boards, baskets, bits of roof that drifted and then got stranded. You smell rot and fresh clay at the same time, and you realize decay and beginning can share the same air. People file out behind you, slowly, carefully, carrying bundles, holding children, guiding animals. They step into mud and make faces. Someone laughs weakly. Someone cries, quietly, like a kettle releasing steam. The animals blink at the open sky, then start doing what animals do, sniffing, shaking water from fur, immediately trying to eat the first plant they see. You are relieved, because normal behavior feels like medicine. You take a few steps forward and look back at the vessel. From the outside, it looks even stranger now. A massive, pitch-dark shape stranded on wet earth. It is both ugly and beautiful, like a scar that saved you. You place a hand on the hull and feel its roughness, the sticky residue of pitch, the grain of wood. You think about the nights of building, the moonlight on ribs, the smell of bitumen, the lies you told to keep people from asking too much. The vessel held. The plan held. You're standing. This is where gratitude should be simple. And of course, it is not. In the flood myths, the survivor often responds by making an offering, a sacrifice, a gesture of thanks or appeasement. The idea is that you acknowledge the divine. Because in that worldview, you do not just survive weather. You survive relationships with powers that can erase you. A mainstream historical fact woven into this moment is that offerings and sacrifices were central in many ancient Mesopotamian religious practices, often involving food and drink presented to deities as a part of ritual life. It makes sense that after surviving a flood, you would do the same. You are re-establishing a link. You are saying, "I am still here. Please do not change your mind." But you also feel something else, something sharp under the gratitude, anger, confusion. Why were you chosen? Why did others die? Why did the gods decide this was the solution? That tension sits in the myth like a stone in a shoe. It does not go away. It just becomes part of the walking. Historians still argue whether the flood narrative is intended to reassure listeners that the gods maintain order even through catastrophe, or to warn them that divine power can be arbitrary and terrifying. Standing on mud that used to be someone's street, you feel both truths at once. The world is ordered enough that you can step onto it again. The world is also frightening enough that it can be rewritten overnight. You explore carefully. You find a patch of reeds still upright, bending in the breeze like survivors bowing to each other. You touch them, and they feel real, firm, alive. You find a small insect crawling on a twig, and you almost laugh because this tiny creature did not get invited onto your vessel. Yet here it is, stubbornly existing anyway. That is your second joke tonight. Amused and sleepy. The gods flood the world and the bugs still show up like. Cool. New neighborhood. You look up at the sky and see birds. Actual birds. Not just the ones you released. They wheel above the water, calling. The sound punches straight through your chest because it means the world is breathing again. You watch them and think about the earlier bird that did not return. Somewhere out there it found land first, and now it is probably stealing someone's future breakfast. Good for it. Then you find the first truly unsettling thing. Silence in the places where human noise should be. No market calls, no children, no smoke. The water has scrubbed away the soundtrack of civilization. You feel grief rise again, quiet and heavy. You do not let it drown you, but you do not deny it either. In myths, grief is often implied rather than described, but it is there, behind every and only we remained. This is where fringe interpretations sometimes try to fill the silence with extra meaning. Some modern fringe storytellers insist the landing is on a specific peak with cosmic significance, or that the survivor is guided to a sacred site, or that the mountain is symbolic of a portal between worlds. The ancient texts do mention mountains in some versions, but they do not hand you a tourist map with coordinates. They give you the feeling you're on the edge between the drowned past and the uncertain future. The rest is human imagination doing what it always does. Building temples out of question mark. You gather your people and begin the first practical tasks. Find fresh water that is not contaminated. Find shelter from wind. Check the animals. Set boundaries so nobody wanders off into waterlogged danger. You realize quickly that survival after disaster is less dramatic than survival during disaster. It is chores. It is careful walking. It is deciding where to place a fire. It is treating blisters. It is trying to keep a child warm. It is the slow work of being alive again. And yet, the myth insists this moment matters. This is the new beginning, the hinge between eras. The flood has rinsed away the old, but it has not magically built the new. That is on you. You stand alone for a moment, staring at the waterline and the stranded debris. You think about the Cuneiform tablet in the museum, about how a scribe pressed wedges into clay to preserve this landing. You realize the tablet is like this mud, soft once, shaped by pressure, then hardened by time. The story itself is a shoreline, a place where something fluid becomes fixed. You inhale and let the air fill your lungs. It feels cleaner now, even with the dampness and rot. It feels like possibility, and possibility is both exciting and exhausting. You turn back to your people and lift your chin, ready to do the next thing, to make the offering, to negotiate with gods and guilt, to begin rebuilding the world with hands that still smell of pitch. You take one slow step, then another, and the mud squelches. Unromantic, but real. The flood is behind you, but its meaning is just ahead, waiting like a quiet figure at the edge of the reeds. You do not celebrate the way you think you should. There is no triumphant music, no fireworks, no dramatic slow-motion shot of you raising your arms to the sky like you just won a very wet marathon. Instead, you feel tired in the deep parts of your bones, the kind of tired that makes your thoughts move like syrup. Survival is not a victory parade. Survival is a quiet checklist. Water, fire, food, shelter, people accounted for, animals still breathing, everyone still here. And then, when the first practical panic settles, the older ritual instinct rises. You look at the sky and you remember that in your world, you do not just live on land, you live under gods, even if you are furious with them. Even if you do not understand them, you still have to deal with them. The way you have to deal with weather, taxes, and that one neighbor who insists on giving you unsolicited advice about everything. That is your first joke tonight. And it lands softly in your head after the flood. The gods are basically your cosmic homeowners association, and they have a lot of opinions about your offerings. You choose a spot on slightly higher ground, a place where the mud is less eager to eat your feet. You gather stones, if you can find them, or bricks salvaged from debris. You build a simple altar, not because you want to be fancy, but because structure matters, order matters. The flood was chaos. Now you are reintroducing form, even in small ways. In many Mesopotamian traditions, offerings are not only gratitude, they are communication, they are diplomacy. Food and drink are presented to the gods, not because gods need to eat in the human sense, but because the act reaffirms hierarchy and connection. A mainstream historical fact sits here like a steady beam. Ancient Mesopotamian religion involved regular offerings and ritual feeding of deities, and temples functioned as economic and social centers where these practices were organized. When you build an altar after the flood, you are doing what people did in that world when they needed stability. You perform the relationship. You prepare what you can. Maybe grain, maybe incense. In some versions, a sacrifice. The story often describes the gods gathering around the offering like flies, which is both vivid and unintentionally savage in its honesty. It suggests that the gods, without humans, become deprived. No offerings means no rituals, means no divine satisfaction. The myth is almost cheeky here, implying that the gods' power does not make them immune to need. They may be cosmic, but they still like the smell of roasted food. It is a detail that makes you squint and smile, because it feels like ancient authors slipping a little sarcasm into theology. You light the fire. Smoke rises into the damp air. At first it struggles, thick and reluctant. Then it climbs in a steady column. The smell curls around you, warm and earthy. It is the first controlled flame after days of storm, and you watch it with the reverence you usually reserve for sunsets. People gather behind you, quiet. Even the animals seem to settle, as if the familiar ritual cadence tells them, yes, we are back in a world that has rules, again. Then the gods respond, at least in the way the myth frames it, not with a visible face in the clouds, but with a shift in atmosphere, a sense that attention has turned toward you. The divine council that argued about flooding the world now argues about what to do with you. In some versions, a god who advocated destruction is angry that anyone survived. Another god, the one who warned you, defends the survival and criticizes the harshness of total annihilation. Historians still argue whether this divine debate is meant as a theological critique of excessive punishment, or as a narrative device to explain why disasters happen but do not always end everything. Either way, the myth gives you something powerful. Even the gods disagree. Even the cosmos has politics. And in that debate, an oath appears, a promise that the flood will not happen again in the same way. A commitment to limits, to restraint. In later traditions, people will frame this as a covenant, a sign, a moral pivot. In the Mesopotamian flood context, the promise can feel more pragmatic. The gods realize wiping out humanity is inconvenient. Because then, who will bring offerings? Who will maintain temples? Who will keep the divine world fed and honored? The myth is both spiritual and transactional, and it doesn't pretend otherwise. You stand by the altar and feel your chest tighten. The promise is relief. But it is also chilling, because it implies the flood was optional. It was a choice, and choices can be repeated, even if someone swears they will not. So you listen for the details of the new arrangement. In some versions, measures are introduced to prevent overpopulation or human noise from reaching unbearable levels again. There are mentions of mortality, of limits, of mechanisms that keep humanity from becoming too numerous. Scholars still argue whether these elements reflect ancient concerns about resource management and social stability, or whether they are simply mythic explanations for why humans suffer and die. Standing on wet earth, you understand the emotional core without needing the footnotes. The gods are setting boundaries, and you are living inside those boundaries. Here, the fringe tidbit sneaks in wearing a serious face. Some modern fringe interpretations read the gods' regret and oath as evidence of a past intervention gone wrong, like an experiment that produced unintended consequences. They framed the promise not as mercy, but as policy change after a failed project. Again, the tablet does not give you corporate meeting minutes from the heavens. It gives you story logic, power acts, then reacts, then negotiates with itself, whether you call it divine, political, or alien. The structure feels familiar because humans know power dynamics intimately. You feel something like resentment flare, then soften. You're alive. Your people are alive. The animals are alive. The offering smoke rises. The sky does not strike you down. You let yourself accept that for now. But the aftermath is not just about gods. It is about you. You turn from the altar and look at your people. They are muddy, exhausted, hungry, and still breathing. They look at you as if you have answers. You want to laugh because you do not. You have a boat and a memory and a lot of responsibilities. That is your second joke. Dry and sleepy. Congratulations. You have been promoted to founder of the post-apocalypse, and there is no instruction manual, only damp vibes. You assign tasks. Some start gathering driftwood. Some check the animals. Some search for higher ground. Someone tries to wring water out of a blanket and realizes, with deep annoyance, that wringing water out of anything in a world that is 90% water is an emotional scam. Everyone is moving now, because movement is how you keep despair from settling in your lungs. As you work, you think about how this scene ends up on clay. A scribe records the offering, the divine response, the oath. Why? Because this is the moral hinge. This is where the flood becomes not just catastrophe, but lesson. The myth is telling future listeners, disaster has meaning. Power can be negotiated. Survival comes with obligations. It is also telling them, even when the world is wiped clean, ritual can restitch the connection between humans and the unseen. Historians still argue whether the flood myths were used to reinforce temple authority and social order, reminding people that divine favor and proper ritual maintain stability, or whether they were more personal, existential narratives about vulnerability and endurance. Both can be true. Myths often do double duty. They comfort and they control. You finish the offering and watch the last smoke drift away, thinning into the clearing sky. The light looks warmer now, the clouds breaking more decisively. You notice a faint rainbow-like shimmer in the mist and almost roll your eyes at how perfectly symbolic nature can be when it wants to show off. That is your third joke. Gentle and modern, the sky really said. Let me add a little visual metaphor. Like it is editing a film, the offering is done, but the aftermath stretches long. The oath has been spoken, but the world is still wet and raw. You gather your people closer together, and you begin the slow work of becoming a society again. One fire, one meal, one decision at a time. Behind you, the stranded vessel sits like a dark monument. In front of you, the land waits, quiet, rinsed, and unfinished. You feel the flood story shifting from survival to memory, from fear to meaning. And somewhere, far away in the future, a scribe presses wedges into clay to make sure this oath, this offering, this complicated mercy, never disappears. You think the hardest part is over because your brain loves that lie. It loves neat endings. Storm ends. Land appears. Offering is made. Promise is spoken. Credits roll. But the real world, and the myth that mirrors it, does not do clean credits. It does aftermath. It does the long, slow process of turning disaster into something you can carry without collapsing. And then quietly, it does the thing you did not expect. It starts losing pieces. Because this flood story you are living is not only happening on wet ground, it is also happening in clay. Somewhere, someone will press wedges into a tablet. Someone else will copy that tablet. Centuries later, another scribe will copy the copy. Then a shelf will fall. A fire will crack the clay. A corner will break off. A line will crumble into dust. And suddenly the story you think is solid becomes a puzzle with missing teeth. You feel that future loss like a chill in your spine as you stand again. In your mind. In the museum. The tablet behind glass looks stable. But you know its edges are chipped, its lines broken. That is what brings you here. Really. Not only the flood, but the fact that the flood survived in fragments. You walk along the case and see that the tablet is not alone. Nearby are other pieces, smaller shards with partial lines. It feels like standing over a shattered mirror, where each fragment reflects a different angle of the same face. This is where tablet wars begin. Not wars with swords, but wars of interpretation. Which fragment fits which story, which line belongs where, which sign is a mistake and which is a clue. The mainstream historical fact in this section is almost mundane, and that is what makes it powerful. Many ancient Mesopotamian texts survive only as fragments, and modern reconstructions often depend on comparing multiple copies from different sites and periods. Scholars build critical additions by aligning overlapping lines, identifying scribal variants, and making informed restorations where the clay is broken. It is slow, meticulous work. It is also the reason you can hear the flood story at all. In your imagination, you watch a scribe at a long table, surrounded by tablets. The scribe is not building a boat now. The scribe is building a text. They squint at wedges the way you squint at a tiny crack in pitch, trying to decide if it matters. They dip a finger in water, smooth a mistake, press again, and then, perhaps, They make an error that will echo for thousands of years. A wedge angled slightly wrong. A sign that could be read two ways. A line accidentally skipped, then corrected by inventing something to fill the gap. Historians still argue whether certain repeated differences between flood tablet versions reflect deliberate editorial choices, like reshaping the myth to suit a particular theological agenda, or whether they are simply the result of scribal mistakes that became tradition through repetition. Both possibilities exist, and the delicious discomfort is that you cannot always tell which is which. The clay does not come with a note saying, "Oops." You lean closer to the imagined wedges. In some versions, the boat's shape and measurements differ. In others, the list of who is brought aboard shifts. Sometimes the god's dialogue is expanded or shortened. Sometimes the storm lasts a different number of days. Sometimes the bird sequence changes. Each variation is like a ripple in a pond, small at the source, big over time. And this is where your sleepy sarcasm wakes up. Because you cannot resist, the ancient world basically invented the first fandom discourse. Actually, in my tablet version, the storm is 6 days and 7 nights. Well, in my tablet, it is 7 days. That is because your copyist was lazy. That is your first joke tonight, and it is too real. Humans have always argued about canon. In the 19th century, when modern scholars begin deciphering cuneiform, they face their own version of the flood. Not water, but fragments. The first readers do not know where many pieces belong. They have to identify language, script style, tablet series. They have to learn that one broken sign can change the meaning of a whole line. When George Smith famously recognizes the flood narrative within the Epic of Gilgamesh tradition, it is not because the tablet is neat. It is because he is patient and obsessed and willing to stare at wedges until they start speaking. You imagine his desk, the lamplight, the dust. He is, in a way, doing what you did building the vessel. Working with imperfect materials under pressure, trying to preserve something from drowning. Then the drama continues. Fragments in museums get catalogued, recatalogued, misfiled, rediscovered. Sometimes a fragment sits unnoticed for decades until someone realizes it matches a missing section of a known text. That moment, when two pieces fit, is like land appearing after endless water. It is relief. It is adrenaline. It is also dangerous. Because fitting pieces can tempt you to force them, to make them align even if the break edges do not truly match. Scholars try not to, but humans are humans. This is where the fringe tidbit enters. Wearing a trench coat made of speculation. Every time there is a broken line, someone out there wants to fill it with something wild. What if the missing section described advanced technology? What if the boat was not a boat? What if the gods were not gods? Sometimes these ideas are playful. Sometimes they are aggressively confident. The truth is simpler and more interesting. The gaps are real, and the responsible way to handle them is to admit uncertainty. But uncertainty is uncomfortable. People want the missing line to be a secret message. They want the broken clay to be a locked door. You stand in the museum and feel the tug of that temptation. A break in the tablet is like a cliffhanger. Your mind wants to jump across it. Yet the calmest, sleepiest truth is that the story survived through chance and labor. Chance, because clay broke and burned and was buried. Labor, because people dug it up, cleaned it, read it, argued over it, and kept it in boxes and catalogs. You imagine the tablet's journey as its own myth. A scribe presses wedges, a library stores it, an empire falls, the building collapses, the tablet breaks, earth covers it, centuries pass, then hands with brushes uncover it, Then hands with pens translate it. Then hands in a museum mount it behind glass. All of that. Just so you can stand here, breathing softly, letting your brain float in a story about water. Historians still argue whether some flood tablets we have today represent a single original narrative or whether there never was one original. Only a family of related stories that scribes continuously reshaped. That debate matters because it changes how you think about meaning. If there was an original, then differences are distortions. If there was a family, then differences are the point. The myth becomes less like a fixed commandment and more like a river, always itself, always changing. You touch the glass lightly with one fingertip. Then remember museum etiquette and pull back like you got caught texting in a class. That is your second joke. Small and sleepy. You almost tried to high-five a 4,000-year-old clay tablet, which is how you know you need more rest. You look at the tiny wedge marks again. Some are crisp, some are worn, some are missing. And you realize the flood story is doing to itself what the flood did to the world. It erases, it preserves, it rearranges. It leaves debris and survivors. It creates gaps that future people will try to bridge. There is something oddly comforting in that. It means the story is not a perfect monument. It is a living ruin. It invites you to listen without demanding that you know everything. It invites you to accept that some lines are gone, and that the missing parts do not have to be filled with certainty. You can let them be quiet. As you drift toward sleep, you imagine a scribe pausing over a tablet, hesitating before pressing the next wedge. The scribe's hand hovers, and for a moment the story is suspended, like a vessel on calm water. Then the stylus presses down, and the line continues, somewhere else. Centuries later, a fragment breaks away, and the line stops. And then, centuries after that, another fragment is found, and the line begins again. This is the rhythm of the flood tablet's afterlife. Loss, rediscovery, argument, and soft, stubborn continuity. You let your breathing match it, slow and steady, as if you are becoming part of the chain of listeners who keep the story afloat. The museum hall feels different now. Not because the lights changed, but because you can sense the shadow of another text behind the one you came for. The flood tablet in front of you is a doorway, and beyond it there is a bigger room, a louder room, where a famous king stands knee-deep in myth, asking questions that never stop echoing. You already know his name the way people know the name of a storm. Gilgamesh. You do not enter a new story like you enter a new chapter. You just keep walking, and the narrative glides. And suddenly the flood is not only yours, it is a story told to a hero who is searching for something impossible. The flood survivor, the one you have been wearing like a cloak, becomes a voice in a larger epic. And that shift changes the texture of everything. It is like hearing your own memory played back through someone else's mouth. Gilgamesh is a king of Uruk in the epic tradition, a figure who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, which is such a bold ratio that you almost respect the audacity. He starts out powerful and restless, then gets cracked open by grief after the death of his companion Enkidu, and then he goes on a quest to find immortality. That is the mainstream historical anchor here. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the most famous works of ancient Mesopotamian literature, preserved on cuneiform tablets in Akkadian, and it includes a flood narrative within it. The flood tale becomes a lesson inside a larger lesson, nested like boxes. You can feel the layers. In the epic, Gilgamesh travels beyond normal boundaries, through wilderness and darkness, across waters that no one is meant to cross, to find Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood and was granted a kind of eternal life. And when he finally arrives, exhausted and desperate, Utnapishtim tells him the flood story, not because Gilgamesh asked for entertainment, but because the flood is proof. It is the evidence for why Utnapishtim is different, and it is the explanation for the rare exception. One human got to slip the net of death, but only once, and under bizarre conditions. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of the flood story in the Gilgamesh epic reflects a deliberate literary strategy to underscore the epic's themes of mortality and human limitation, or whether it represents the merging of older independent traditions into a composite masterpiece. You do not need to choose to feel the effect. The flood story inside Gilgamesh becomes less about water and more about time. It becomes a reminder that even the most dramatic survival does not grant you control over life's ending. You imagine Gilgamesh listening. He is a king, but he is also a frightened man, and the flood narrative lands on him like a wet cloak. He hears about the gods deciding to erase humanity. He hears about the warning whispered through a wall. He hears about the boat built with pitch and urgency. He hears the storm. He hears the birds. He hears the landing. And somewhere in his chest, he realizes a terrible thing, even when a human survives the end of the world. The reward is not a permanent escape from loss. The reward is more living, more rebuilding, more grief. That is your first joke tonight, whispered with gentle sarcasm. Because you cannot help it, Gilgamesh travels across half the universe for immortality and gets handed a bedtime story about how you still cannot outrun the cosmic group project. The flood narrative in Gilgamesh is also one of the reasons modern audiences connect it to later flood traditions in other cultures. People notice parallels. They draw lines. They argue about influence, transmission, shared memory. The epic version became widely known after 19th century discoveries and translations, and it sparked all kinds of comparisons. Some scholars emphasize ancient Near Eastern literary exchange, where motifs travel across languages and regions. Others caution against assuming direct borrowing without evidence for specific pathways. Historians still argue whether certain similarities between Mesopotamian flood accounts and later flood narratives reflect direct transmission, broader shared cultural environments, or independent responses to common flood experiences. The debate is real, and it is careful, and it is often less dramatic than internet arguments would like it to be. But the shadow of Gilgamesh does something else too. It changes your emotional angle. In earlier sections, you were the survivor inside the vessel. Now you are also the listener, the one sitting at the edge of someone else's story, trying to extract a secret from it. That listener energy is familiar. It is you in the museum, leaning into the glass, hoping the wedges will speak. You picture the clay itself in motion. The Gilgamesh epic exists in multiple versions, compiled and edited over time, with what scholars often call the standard Babylonian version being a later, more stabilized form. The flood tablet you are thinking of might be from that tradition, or it might echo older strands. Either way, it is part of a textual ecosystem. You can almost see scribes choosing which lines to keep, which to polish, which to align with the epic's broader themes. A flood story told to a king on a quest for immortality will naturally emphasize things like divine favor, exceptional survival, and the impossibility of repeating that exception. And then there is the quirky detail that feels like a wink. After hearing the flood story, Gilgamesh still tries to win immortality through a test of staying awake, and he fails almost immediately. It is the ultimate human moment. The hero is told about cosmic destruction, divine politics, survival, and the limits of life. And then he cannot keep his eyes open. The myth is basically telling you gently, that even kings cannot beat sleep. That is your second joke tonight, and it is perfect for this channel. Gilgamesh cannot survive the Stay Awake challenge. And honestly, neither can you. And that is the point. Utnapishtim's story becomes a mirror held up to Gilgamesh's desperation. The flood survivor is the one person who got the rare prize, but even he does not offer Gilgamesh a shortcut. Instead, he offers perspective. He offers the reality that the gods do not hand out immortality like candy. He offers the idea that life is precious because it ends, and because it is fragile, and because even an ark cannot keep everything. The fringe tidbit slips in her because Gilgamesh always attracts it. Some modern fringe storytellers focus on the epic's divine human language. The mention of gods, the dramatic journey beyond the edge of the world, and they interpret it as evidence of ancient contact with advanced beings or lost technologies. They read Utnapishtim's immortality as genetic modification or as a transfer to another realm. The text itself supports something more grounded and more mythic. It portrays immortality as an exception granted by the gods, and it uses that exception to heighten the epic's central sorrow. But the fringe persists because the epic's imagery is so rich, it invites projection. Like a dark lake invites a moon's reflection. You stand in the museum and feel how the flood story changes depending on who is listening. For a frightened community, it is a warning and a promise. For a king mourning his friend, it is a lesson about limits. For a modern visitor, it is a bridge between deep time and your own private fears about loss and change. Historians still argue whether the earliest flood narrative served primarily as community memory of disaster, as theological instruction, or as literary artistry. The truth can be multiple at once. Myths do not pick one job. They do all of them. They carry history, meaning, and emotion, and they keep doing it even when the clay breaks. You take a slow breath and imagine Gilgamesh stepping away from Utnapishtim after hearing the flood story. He is not soothed. He is not magically enlightened. He is simply changed. The flood narrative has pressed a wedge into his mind. It has left a mark, and that is what happens to you too. You came to the tablet for a flood, and you found a shadow king beside it, reminding you that every flood story is also a story about what comes after the water, which is living and losing and trying again. You feel the museum air cool your face. You feel the quiet. You feel the way your thoughts slur, like a river settling after a storm. The flood is still there, in the wedges. Gilgamesh is there too, listening in the dark. And you, in between. Start drifting toward the next question the story asks. What is myth? What is memory? And how much of this is water and how much is us? You stay in the museum a little longer, not because there is a bench with excellent back support, though that would be nice, but because your mind is caught between two feelings that do not usually share the same space. One feeling says, this is myth, a crafted story, gods and omens and symbolic birds. The other feeling says, this is memory, a bruised recollection of real water doing real damage to real people. The flood tablet sits between those feelings like a quiet referee, and you realize the real question is not which one is true. The question is how they intertwine. You step back from the glass and let your eyes soften. When you stop trying to read the wedges, they become texture again, like ripples frozen in clay. That image makes you think of silt. Floods leave silt, thick, fine, sticky layers that cover floors and fill courtyards and bury seeds too deep. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at some Mesopotamian sites, and people have long debated what those layers mean in relation to flood stories. The mainstream historical fact here is simply that the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia were shaped by river flooding, and ancient settlements experienced significant flood events that could leave sediment layers and disrupt communities. This is the sort of truth that does not need a god to be terrifying. So maybe there was a bad flood. Maybe there were many bad floods. Maybe one particularly catastrophic event imprinted itself so deeply that it became the skeleton for a myth. Or maybe the myth formed first as a moral and cosmic story, and then real floods kept feeding it new flesh. Historians still argue whether the flood narrative reflects a single historical catastrophe, a cultural memory of recurring floods, or a literary motif designed to explore divine power and human fragility. You can feel the uncertainty like a gentle mist. It does not ruin the story. It makes it honest. You think about what people do after disaster. They talk. They tell stories. They look for reasons. If a river ruins your crops, you do not just say, "Unlucky." You say, "Why?" And in a world where the divine is woven into daily life, why becomes which gourd, which offense, which warning we missed. Myth is not only entertainment, it is an explanatory engine. It turns trauma into a narrative you can repeat, and repeating it gives you the illusion of control. Not full control, but enough to sleep. That is your first joke tonight, delivered with a gentle, sleepy bite. Humans see a flood and immediately go, "Okay, but who do I need to complain to?" As if the universe has customer service. And then, because you are you, your mind drifts toward the debates modern scholars have in quieter rooms with brighter lamps. They compare texts. They compare layers of soil. They compare flood myths from different cultures. They argue about diffusion versus independent invention. They ask whether similar motifs, like a chosen survivor and a boat and birds, indicate direct borrowing or shared human responses to the same fear. They ask whether the god's motivation, like being annoyed by human noise in some Mesopotamian versions, reflects specific local concerns rather than universal moral themes. Historians still argue whether the noise motif is a metaphor for social disorder and overcrowding or a literalized divine complaint within the myth's own worldview. You like that scholars argue, because arguing means they care. It also means the story is alive. You tilt your head and think about scale. A local river flood can feel world-ending if your world is one city, one plain, one horizon you never leave. If water covers your fields and you have nowhere to run, it might as well be the entire earth. So when a myth says the whole world flooded, it may be speaking emotionally rather than geographically. The flood covers everything you know. That is enough. Your nervous system does not require a globe to panic. It only requires rising water at the doorstep. This is where myth becomes meaning. The flood is not a weather report. It is a story about fragility, about the thinness of normal life. It is about how quickly markets and festivals and family dinners can dissolve. It is about the terror of helplessness. And it is about the strange human ability to build a vessel anyway, to gather seeds and tools and breath, and to keep going. You remember the moment you shut the vessel door? That was not only survival. That was a boundary. That was a decision to accept loss and still move forward. The myth is asking listeners to imagine that moment, to rehearse it in their minds, so that when real floods come, or real disasters of any kind, the idea of preparation and courage is already pressed into the psyche like a wedge in clay. Your second joke slides in, low and soft, because you cannot resist poking modern life. The flood myth is basically ancient disaster preparedness content, except instead of buy batteries, it is coat your giant boat in tar and hope the gods do not change their mind. Then the fringe tidbit arrives, because the line between myth and memory is exactly where fringe loves to set up camp. Some fringe interpretations claim the flood is evidence of a lost advanced civilization, that only a select few were preserved, that the story encodes ancient science or alien intervention. Others claim the flood is a global geological event remembered in oral tradition, like a sudden sea level jump or catastrophic tsunami. The truth is that flood myths are common worldwide, and their meanings vary. Some may preserve local disaster memories. Some may spread through cultural contact. Some may arise independently because water is one of the most universal threats humans face. The flood tablet does not solve that. It participates in it, and here is the quiet, sleepy point. You do not need the fringe to make the story powerful. The power is already here, in the mix of practical detail and cosmic drama. The bitumen is real. The rivers are real. The fear is real. The gods are the language people used to talk about forces they could not control. You look again at the wedges and think about translation. Every translation is a negotiation between certainty and nuance. A single sign can be read differently depending on context. A broken line can be restored with an educated guess. The translator has to decide whether a word is literal or metaphorical, whether a phrase is technical or poetic. Historians still argue over certain key terms in flood texts, especially where the tablet is damaged or where rare words appear, because meaning hangs on those tiny decisions. It is almost funny how huge ideas depend on tiny scratches, which is also how your own life works. If you think about it, a single decision, a small word, a brief moment, can redirect everything. You let your shoulders drop. The museum air feels cooler now, and your body is sliding toward sleep. You realize the myth is doing its job. It is letting you hold a fear without being overwhelmed by it. It is giving shape to the shapeless. You picture the flood as water, and you picture it as metaphor. You picture it as historical memory of a river that rose too high. You picture it as cosmic story about order and chaos. You picture it as a lesson nested inside Gilgamesh's grief. You picture it as a tablet broken and found again. Then you picture yourself, right now, in your own room, listening, with your own small anxieties, your own modern floods, deadlines, news, climate dread, relationship storms. The myth does not fix those. It simply says, softly, humans have always lived with forces bigger than them. Humans have always tried to prepare, to interpret, to survive. Historians still argue whether the flood story's enduring popularity comes from its historical roots, its moral structure, or its raw psychological resonance. You suspect it is the last one. The flood is an image of being overwhelmed. The boat is an image of refuge. The birds are an image of hope. The landing is an image of beginning again. You take a slow breath and let that structure settle inside you like calm water in a jar. Myth and memory do not have to fight. They can be two hands holding the same clay, shaping it into something you can carry into the night. You leave the strict hush of the museum in your mind and drift into something softer, because now the flood tablet is not only an ancient object, it is a mirror you keep noticing in modern windows. The wedges are old, but the feeling underneath them is familiar, the sensation that the world can change too fast, that water can rise, that plans can break, that you might have to build a vessel long before you can prove you need it. You carry that thought the way you carry a warm mug between rooms, careful not to spill it. Outside the museum, in your imagination, the city is modern again. Streetlights glow, phones buzz, news cycles churn. People argue online about things that would confuse a Mesopotamian scribe and also, honestly, things that would feel completely recognizable. You walk past a convenience store where bottled water is stacked in a neat pyramid, and you have the unsettling realization that the most ancient survival instinct is still being sold in plastic. You almost laugh. That is your first joke tonight. Quiet and a little bleak. We used to seal boats with bitumen. Now we seal our anxiety in shrink wrap. The flood tablet's meaning begins to settle into a handful of simple lessons. Not preachy, just there. Like stones you keep stepping on. 1. Preparation is a kind of love. In the myth, you build before the rain. You gather tools, grain, rope, and you do it while everyone else is still bargaining in the market and laughing at your weird project. That is what readiness looks like. Not panic buying at the last second, but slow, deliberate building. In modern life, your ark might be an emergency kit. Sure, but it might also be routines, savings, friendships, skills, therapy, boundaries, the unglamorous infrastructure of staying upright. The myth is basically saying, if you get a warning, even a small one, do not waste it. 2. You cannot save everyone, and that hurts. The flood story refuses to be fully comforting. There is always loss. There is always a door that closes. The myth is a rehearsal for grief, a way to imagine it without having to live it all at once. Historians still argue whether the flood narratives were meant to warn communities into obedience and ritual, or to offer catharsis by externalizing disaster into a story with a survivor. Either way, the emotional truth remains. Survival carries guilt, and guilt needs somewhere to go. In the myth, it goes into offerings, into oaths, into memory pressed into clay. 3. Power is complicated. The gods in the flood stories are not pure goodness or pure evil. They are divided, reactive, sometimes regretful, sometimes petty. That is unsettling, but it also feels realistic in a human way. The myth is teaching you that even systems that claim to be orderly can behave chaotically. That lesson travels well into modernity. Governments, institutions, workplaces, even families can act like divine councils, arguing, deciding, reversing, regretting. Your job is not to romanticize them. Your job is to build your vessel anyway. That is your second joke tonight, whispered like a late-night aside. The ancient gods are basically a messy group chat with unlimited admin privileges, and you are just trying to keep your boat from sinking. You keep walking, and the flood tablet's images keep translating themselves into modern equivalents. The sealed vessel becomes your home, your body, your mental health. The bitumen becomes the sticky habits that keep you waterproof. Sleep, hydration, small rituals, saying no. The birds become tiny tests of safety. Checking in with yourself, asking a friend how they are really doing, looking outside and noticing whether your stress is a storm or just a passing cloud. And then, because you are living in 2026 and not 2000 BCE, the flood's meaning brushes against a big modern shadow. Climate fear, rising seas, heavier storms, unpredictable weather. The myth feels suddenly less like a distant story and more like a mood in the room. You do not have to turn this into doom. You can hold it gently. The flood tablet does not say the world ends forever. It says the world changes violently, and then people rebuild. That does not excuse ignoring real problems. It just reminds you that humans have always had to live with uncertainty and still act. The fringe tidbit slides in here in a surprisingly useful way. Even when fringe interpretations are not evidence-based, they reveal something about what people crave. A sense that disasters have a cause that can be named, a culprit that can be argued with, a pattern that can be decoded. It is uncomfortable to accept that some things are complex and messy and partly uncontrollable. So people reach for hidden explanations. The flood tablet, in its quiet way, offers a healthier option. You may not control the water, but you can control your preparation, your compassion, your craft. You pause at a crosswalk in your imagination, watching cars glide past in the rain. The street's wet sheen reflects neon like a river of color. You think about the ancient rivers and how they shaped cities, fed fields, and also destroyed them. Water has always been both gift and threat. It is the oldest double-edged thing. Your body knows this instinctively. That is why flood stories land in your nervous system so easily. They speak to something pre-verbal, the fear of being submerged. So you slow your breathing. Inhale like drawing in air through a reed straw. Exhale like letting silt settle. The story becomes a kind of guided meditation without pretending to be one. It gives you images to hold. You imagine yourself building an ark in small ways, not a giant boat, just a tiny raft of habits and supports. You imagine checking your metaphorical pitch seals. Are you sleeping enough? Are you eating enough? Are you talking to someone? Are you letting stress seep through cracks? You imagine sending out birds in your day, taking a walk, stepping away from a screen, asking a real question instead of doom scrolling. If the bird returns, you wait. If it doesn't, maybe it found land. Maybe you did. Historians still argue whether the enduring flood motif across many cultures arises from shared human psychology, shared environmental experiences, or cultural exchange over millennia. You can feel the psychological part right now. The flood is the feeling of overwhelm. The boat is the feeling of refuge. The bird is the feeling of hope. The landing is the feeling of beginning again. You reach the other side of the crosswalk and glance back, as if the museum is behind you. In your mind, it is. The tablet sits under glass. Quiet, but you are carrying its shape in your thoughts. The wedges become a reminder that even the oldest anxieties can be shaped into something structured, something that does not drown you. That is your third joke tonight. Soft and kind. If ancient scribes could press their stress into clay and call it literature, you can probably write down your worries in a notes app and call it self-care. Not identical. But the spirit is there. The night deepens. The modern city hum turns into a distant lullaby. You feel the story preparing you for the last return. The final loop back to the museum glass, where the tablet waits like a calm shoreline. You have walked through myth, through memory, through meaning. Now you are ready to let the water in your mind settle completely, to return to the quiet case, to your own breath, to the soft ending that feels like drifting. You find yourself back in front of the glass again, because stories like this always pull you to the place where the mark was first pressed. The museum hall is quieter now in your mind, as if closing time has come and the last footsteps have faded. The air feels cool and still. The lights above the case glow softly, not harsh, not bright. Just enough to make the tablet's wedges shimmer when you shift your angle. You stand there with your hands relaxed at your sides, shoulders loose, breathing slow, like you have finally learned how to match your body to the pace of clay. The flood story is no longer loud. It is no longer a storm. It is a settled lake. You lean in a little. Not because you think you can suddenly read Akkadian by sheer willpower, but because you want to be close to the fact of it. Someone pressed these wedges. Someone decided the flood mattered enough to preserve. Someone made a small sum. Stubborn object that outlasted kings, fires, libraries, and the slow appetite of time that, in itself, is a kind of victory that does not require cheering. The tablet's surface is uneven. Some signs are crisp. Some are worn down like old footsteps on stone. A corner is missing. A hairline crack runs through a line like a thin scar. You let your eyes follow it without trying to fix it. The break is part of the story's truth. The flood in clay is not perfect, and neither is your memory of it. And that feels strangely comforting. Historians still argue whether the flood tablet versions represent a single authoritative narrative or a living tradition that changed as it traveled across cities and centuries. Standing here, you finally feel that the argument is less important than the sensation. The story kept moving. It kept being copied, told, corrected, misread, rescued. It behaved like a river, and like a river, it carried silt and seeds and debris. Some parts sank, some parts washed up again later. That is how stories survive. You picture the vessel again, stranded on wet ground, black with pitch, smelling like burned earth and hope. You picture the birds. You picture the mud under your feet, unglamorous and real. You picture the offering smoke rising into a damp sky. You picture Gilgamesh listening in the dark, failing to stay awake, learning that even kings cannot bargain with sleep. The images drift through you now without snagging. They pass like clouds. That is your first joke tonight, and it is almost a whisper. You came here to look at a tablet, and somehow the tablet looked back and said, "Great, now you're emotionally waterproofed. Like it just installed a brand new seal on your brain." You smile, barely. The meaning you carry out of the flood is quiet and personal now. It is not a lecture. It is not a prophecy. It is a reminder that overwhelm is ancient, that humans have always had storms, and that making a vessel can be as small as building a routine, as simple as breathing on purpose. The flood tablet does not promise you control. It offers you continuity. It says, when the water rises, you can still do something. You can still gather. You can still build. You can still wait for the storm to tire. And it also says, gently, you can rest. You let your posture soften even more. The museum glass reflects your face faintly over the wedges. And for a moment, it looks like you are inside the tablet. Part of the clay. Part of the long chain of listeners. You find that soothing. You do not have to solve the flood's mysteries tonight. You do not have to pick a side between myth and memory. You can let both exist in the same room. The way the tablet holds both practical details and cosmic drama without apologizing. The second joke arrives like a soft tap on wood. If the ancient gods really were annoyed by human noise, you are doing great right now by lying here quietly, basically earning divine bonus points for being sleepy. You breathe in. You breathe out. The tablet sits, patient. The hall feels like it is floating, a little vessel of light in a dark sea of night. Your thoughts slow to the pace of silt settling at the bottom of water. You notice details that feel gentle, the steady hum of the museum's air system in your imagination, the muted glow on clay, the way the wedge marks form neat rows like a field after planting. The story's violence is far away now, softened by distance and by your own calm. You begin to feel the ending not as a stop, but as a drift, like the vessel finally coming to rest, not with a crash, but with a small, satisfied scrape of wood against earth. Now the wind down begins, and you let it. You imagine the rivers again, but quiet this time, their surfaces smooth, carrying moonlight instead of debris. You imagine reeds swaying, making that soft brushing sound that feels like whispers. You imagine a distant city rebuilt, small fires in courtyards, families eating in peace, children laughing in a world that has learned, at least for a while, to be gentle. You imagine the scribe, long after, sitting with a damp tablet in their lap, pressing wedges with calm hands, not rushing, not panicking, just preserving. The stylus lifts, presses, lifts, presses, like a heartbeat that knows it will be heard. Historians still argue whether the flood story's deepest purpose is to warn, to explain, or to comfort. Tonight, for you, it can be comfort. Not the kind that pretends nothing bad can happen, but the kind that says you are not alone in fearing it. People feared it thousands of years ago, too. People built arks out of reeds and pitch. And people build arks now out of friendship and preparation and quiet moments like this. Your eyelids feel heavier. Your jaw unclenches. Your shoulders sink into whatever bed or couch or pillow you are actually on, even as your mind lingers in the museum's cool hush. The tablet becomes smaller in your inner vision, just a dark rectangle under light, a calm object that holds a storm without making it loud. The wedges blur gently, becoming texture, becoming ripples, becoming the soft pattern your mind can follow down into sleep. You take one more slow breath, as if drawing in the last bit of lantern warmth from inside the vessel. You exhale, as if letting the hatch close softly, not in fear this time, but in safety. Outside, the storm is gone, the water is calm, the birds are quiet. The land is there, steady under your feet, even if you are not standing, and the tablet, behind its glass, keeps its patient silence, holding the flood so you do not have to. End of script. Sweet dreams.